Now in this series, we will look in depth into integers, floats, and number strings. So, one thing to notice about PHP is that it provides automatic data type conversion. So if you assign an integer value to a variable, the type of that variable will automatically be an integer. Then if you assign a string to the same variable, the type will change to a string. So this automatic conversion can sometimes break your code if care is not taken. So PHP integers, like we said in the previous lecture, and I showed you the range of an integer value. And as you know that an integer is a number without any decimal path. So let's now look deeper into integers and the bit systems in integer. So what we're just going to do here is I'm just going to write a comment here, and I'm going to say integers. And then first of all, I want to write a multi-comment code, or multi-line comment rather, sorry. Okay, so this, I want us to see the range again. So you have 214, 748. And then in 64 bits, it's a little bit voluminous. Okay, so if you see this comment which I've written in a um, multi-line way, a multi-line comment, you will see that here we have this figure, this range in 32-bit systems, and we have this range in 64-bit systems. Now, a value greater than this will be stored as a float because it exceeds the limit of an integer. So, which we have here, trust me, is going to be stored as a float. So that is what PHP does for you. Now, another thing to know is that even if you have something like this, I'm still going to put it in the comment. If you have something like this, 6 multiplied by 2.5, 2.5. Now, you know that normally, or let's say 4, okay, let's say 4 multiplied by this, we're still going to come to operators, but this is this asterisk means multiplication in most programming languages. So if you have something like this, the result will be stored as a float instead of an integer, because one of the operands is a float, which is 2.5. Remember that this is not an integer. So if you have an operation like this, the result, which is going to be 10, will be stored as a float, not an integer. That is something to note in PHP. Now, like we discussed in the previous tutorial, that there are some rules that governs integers. Like integers must have at least one value, and all of the other rules. If you're not familiar with the rules, you can go back to my data type tutorials to actually have a clue of what we're talking about. So PHP has some predefined constants for integers. Now, the first one which we'll be seeing is PHP int and max. Now, for these constants, it supports the largest integer. And then we have PHP int and min, which supports the smallest integer. So here you have smallest, and here you have largest. Okay? Now, there is another one which is called int size. Int size, which talks about the size in bytes. Okay? It talks about the size of an integer in bytes. So, PHP has some functions to check if the type of a variable is actually an integer. So some of these inbuilt functions to check is int. That's one of them. Another one is integer. Okay, and another one is long. Now, is long is it's very similar to is int. Okay, and we're going to see how this plays out in a moment. So let's go to our code, and then let's try to look at let's try to do some arithmetics here. So what we're going to do here is let's just say, let's remove this line, and let's start by saying, let's declare a variable, and we're just going to say, remember that when you want to declare a variable, it starts with the dollar sign. So we say, I want to declare the variable of x, and I'm going to say that x equals, let's say, 987. Now, we have what we're doing here is we're storing this figure inside of this variable. So here, if you say echo x, you're going to get these digits. So let's see that. You see that? Now we get that digit exactly. So what do we want to do here? We want to use some of these functions, some of these inbuilt PHP functions, to look at what we are actually doing. We want to check if this is actually an integer, if the type of this variable is an integer. So what I'm going to do here now is I'll just say is int. Here I'm going to use a debugging function, which is var_dump. Okay, so I'm going to say is int, and I'll just pass in our variable, which is x. So if I save this var_dump is a way also to output. You can see this is int is telling us it's true. So this is actually an integer. Okay, and if I say is long and I save, you can see it's still telling us true, because is int and is long, like I said here earlier, they are very similar. Now let's look at another function. Let's say is int here, But what we're going to do here is we'll make this a float. So if we say 9.87, and then we'll come back here and refresh our page, you can see that it's giving us false. So it is saying that this is not an integer. 9.87, because of this decimal, is no more an integer. And that is an inbuilt PHP function to check if you have an integer or you have a float. So now that we have a float value, we have some inbuilt functions to check float values and doubles also in PHP. So the first thing which I want you to know is that there are some constants, just like the constants which we have here for integer, which we have PHP int max, min, and size. We have sort of for float values also. So now let's look at that for float values. So here, one of the predefined constants for floats is PHP float, and then we have max, okay, and we have PHP float min too. We have min, okay. Now, for these, this is the largest. PHP float max is the largest. It's for the largest representation floating point, representable floating point rather. And then we have PHP float min, which is the smallest representable positive floating point number, okay. And we have float dig, float dig, okay. Now this is the number of decimal digits that can be rounded into a float and back without any precision loss. That is what this constant does for us, okay. So apart from this dig, we also have, sorry, that should be 2, not 4. We also have PHP float epsilon. Now this is the smallest representable positive number, okay. So how do we now check if this is a float or is a double or is an int or whatever? We already looked at int. So let's look at float now. So we have is float function, okay. This is also an inbuilt function. And we also have is double. So we can also say is double. So with this, is double is also a little bit similar to is float. Is also similar to is float. So here, let us say is double. And let's see what we got here. You can see we have true. And if we say is float, and we refresh this page, you still have true, because this is a float and not an integer. Now, another number function which we'll be looking at is infinity. Now, what do we mean by infinity? A numeric value that is larger than float max is considered infinite. So in PHP, any numeric value that is larger, that is bigger than PHP float max is considered infinite. So PHP has some functions to check if a number value is finite or infinite. So you can actually say is infinite or is finite. You get it? Now, what we're saying is this. Let me put it out. You can say is finite, okay? And you can also say is infinite. That is as simple as this. However, this vadom function actually does some work behind the scenes for us. So if we have 9.8e and then we have like this figure here, and then we say vadom, let's see what we get. You can see float and infinite. You see that? So vadom actually does some works behind the scene. Vadom function returns the data type and the value for us. It returns the data type. So you can see that it's infinite. Now, we have another function, another inbuilt function in PHP, which stands for not a number. This inbuilt function tells you if this is a number or not. So how do we go about this? It's simply called none. That is what it is, none. So none is used for impossible mathematical operations. So PHP has a function to check if a value is not a number. And the function is simply is none. It's as simple as that. This function tells you if it is not a number. But the good thing about this is this vadom function, which we use for our debugging, also helps us behind the scenes, and it does a lot of work for us. So if let's say that we have a numeric calculation, like we could say, and we just pass an argument of 9, and if we refresh this, you can see float, and it is not a number. You see that? That is what not a number helps us to do. It tells us if this is a mathematical operation or it's an invalid one or an impossible one. That is what it does. So now we have PHP numeric strings. And what do we mean by numeric strings? PHP is numeric function helps us to achieve this. So all we need to do is we say is numeric. The is numeric function helps us to do this, to complete this task. So let's say we have this figure, and then we can actually say is numeric, and then we'll pass in our variable, and if you refresh this, you should get true. You see that? Quotes. So with this function, we can actually know if PHP classifies these as numbers or not. So let's check this out. Let's refresh. Despite the fact that it's in double quotes, it's converting it into numbers. So it's still telling us that this is true. It is numbers. You see that? Because if you refresh this page now, you still get the Boolean value, and it's true. So let's try something else. Let's try to add this to a number, and then we say is numeric, and you still find it true. So here, if we now say, if we come echo x, what do we have? Let's see. You see 27, you see the number? It has actually added this digits to this digit, and it's giving us the output. So it's telling you that PHP is actually converting these for you into a number. You don't need to do any work. It does all that behind the scene. Now, let's test for something. Let's say here we have this, and we just say hello. And let's see. You can see that it's giving us false. So it's not numeric. This is not numeric. That's why you have false. It's not a number. Let us talk about casting strings and floats to integers. What do we mean by casting? It means that you want to try to convert. That's what casting means. You want to try to put something which is not its type into another. Now, sometimes you need to cast a numeric value into another data type. Okay, like the integer or the int value, the int function, the integer function, or the int value function are used to convert a value to an integer. So how can we do this? Let's check this out. Here we have this value. Let's change this. Let's say that we have 2, 3, 4, 9, this. Like, this is actually a float. It's not an integer. Now, we now want to make this an integer at all means, by all costs. So what to do? We just say int x, and then we say we want to cast this now. Okay, so we're going to say int, all right, and then we now put our variable. And then if we come here and we echo our int x, what do we get? You see that? 2, 3, 4. Why? Because we already done the casting here. We have casted this float into an integer. Okay? Now, let's cast a string to an integer. Let us say that this, we want to put this in double quotes. This is not an integer. All right? It's still the same process. So here, we have actually casted this into an integer here, and we have assigned it to this variable. And now we echo this variable. So if we refresh this, we still get the same thing. So if we come here and say this is 7, and save and refresh, you get that 7. You see that? That is casting strings and floats to integers. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.